Picture a convoy of 3,000 trucks parked bumper to bumper in a single field in the spring of 1945. Every engine still runs, every tire still holds air, and within days every single officer who once commanded them is gone. Who owns a truck when the army that built it no longer exists? Nobody had an answer. Not the generals, not the politicians, not the 4 separate armies now standing on German soil, arguing over who got to keep the keys. This is the story of what really happened to Germany's captured supply trucks after the surrender in 1945. And the real answer is stranger than anything you've heard before. Some of these trucks ended up rebuilding the very cities they once helped destroy. Others were shipped 1,000 miles east and never seen again. A few kept fighting wars for another decade under a different flag entirely. Stay with this one. The ending will surprise you. To understand why so many trucks were even left behind, you have to understand how badly the German army needed them in the first place. The Wehrmacht never had the sleek mechanized force you see in the propaganda reels. Behind every panzer division rolling across a newsreel screen sat a logistics system held together with spare parts and desperation. Historians count more than 100 different truck and staff car designs pressed into German service by the middle of the war. Opel built the 3-ton Blitz at its Rüsselsheim plant. Mercedes-Benz produced the heavier L4500 diesel. Büssing-NAG turned out the 6-wheeled troop carriers that hauled infantry across Poland and France and deep into the Soviet Union. None of these vehicles were designed to work together. None of them shared parts. A mechanic trained on one brand often couldn't fix another. Germany fought the largest war in human history using a supply fleet that never once managed to standardize itself. By 1943, the strain was showing everywhere. Fuel shortages crippled entire divisions. Winter cold seized up engines never designed for Russian temperatures. Allied bombers began targeting the very factories building replacement trucks, and by 1944, the Rüsselsheim Opel plant lay in ruins, after repeated raids flattened its assembly lines. And still the army kept scraping together every vehicle it could find. Farm trucks got requisitioned, civilian delivery vans got painted field grey and sent east. By the final months of the war, entire units moved supplies on horse-drawn carts because the trucks simply weren't there anymore. The machines that survived became more valuable than gold. Whoever still had a working engine controlled whether a division ate that week or starved. Everything was about to change in a matter of weeks. Then in May of 1945, the shooting stopped. Berlin fell. The surrender documents were signed and an army of roughly 11 million men simply stopped existing almost overnight. Every base emptied. Every depot sat abandoned. And scattered across what remained of Germany sat tens of thousands of trucks with nobody left to command them. Reports from occupation officers describe fields near Kassel and outside Munich packed wheel to wheel with abandoned Wehrmacht vehicles stretching further than the eye could see. Some units had simply parked their trucks in an orderly row before surrendering as if awaiting inspection from an officer who would never arrive again. Fuel dumps sat untouched. Spare parts warehouses sat locked. An army that fought for 6 years to keep its trucks running was gone in a single afternoon and left every single one behind. 4 separate occupying powers now stood on German soil, and every one of them looked at those trucks and saw something different. The Americans saw logistics assets they could use immediately for their own occupation duties. The British saw scrap value and salvage potential. The French saw a chance to rebuild an army gutted by 4 years of German occupation. And the Soviets saw reparations. Real reparations. Payment in steel and rubber and horsepower for a homeland reduced to ash from Stalingrad to the outskirts of Moscow. Within weeks of the surrender, all 4 zones began drawing up wildly different plans for what to do with the mountains of captured equipment sitting in their territory. Nobody coordinated. Nobody agreed. And the fight over who got which truck was only the beginning of a much stranger story. So what actually happened to all of it? The full picture only comes into focus once you follow each occupation zone separately, because each one wrote its own ending to this story. Start in the Soviet zone because their answer was the most ruthless and the most immediate. Stalin's government treated captured German industry as a resource to be extracted rather than administered. Entire factory lines, including surviving truck plants, got disassembled bolt by bolt and loaded onto rail cars bound for the Soviet Union. Captured vehicles followed the same path east in staggering numbers. Some estimates place the total value of industrial reparations shipped from the Soviet zone in the billions of dollars measured in 1945 currency. Trucks that once hauled ammunition toward Kursk and Leningrad now hauled machinery in the opposite direction, back toward the very country they had invaded. The Soviets even formed joint stock companies to run surviving German factories under direct Moscow control for years afterward, before finally handing them back to the new East German state in the early 1950s. The machines built to conquer the Soviet Union ended up rebuilding it instead. The French zone tells a completely different story, and it might be the strangest one of all. France emerged from occupation with almost no functioning military transport of its own. 4 years of German rule had stripped the country of trucks, buses, and fuel. So when French forces moved into their occupation zone in southwestern Germany, they didn't scrap what they found. They kept it running. Captured Opel Blitz trucks and Mercedes diesels entered French army service in huge numbers, repainted and repurposed almost immediately. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. Many of these ex-Wehrmacht trucks didn't stay in Europe. As France dragged itself into a brutal colonial war in Indochina beginning in 1946, some of that captured German equipment shipped out with French forces bound for Southeast Asia. Trucks originally built to supply Rommel's Africa Corps or push toward Stalingrad ended up hauling French colonial troops through the jungles of Vietnam nearly a decade after the war that built them had already ended. A truck manufactured for Hitler's army was still on active military duty in 1954, fighting an entirely different war on the other side of the planet. Now turn to the American and British zones, because their solution created one of the great ironies of the post-war period. Occupation forces needed transport for their own operations immediately, so plenty of captured trucks simply switched hands and kept driving under Allied colors. But the bigger story sits closer to home. Germany itself lay in ruins. Roughly 70% of housing in cities like Cologne and Hamburg had been destroyed or damaged. Rubble covered streets so completely that clearing it became a full-time occupation for hundreds of thousands of German civilians, known as the Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women, who hauled brick and stone by hand for years. And what hauled the debris away once it was piled up? Trucks. Often the very same military trucks that had rolled through those same streets under swastika banners only months earlier. Opel actually resumed limited production of the Blitz truck at the shattered Rüsselsheim plant under Allied supervision as early as 1946, because Germany desperately needed working vehicles for reconstruction, and there simply weren't enough new ones to go around. The company kept building variations of that same wartime design for civilian and reconstruction use well into the 1950s, before finally retiring it in 1953 and handing the design rights over to Mercedes-Benz, which continued producing a near-identical successor model for years afterward. The exact same trucks that helped tear German cities apart spent the next decade putting them back together. There's another layer to this most documentaries skip entirely. Relief organizations arriving in occupied Germany faced an enormous transport problem of their own. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration needed thousands of vehicles to move food and medicine and displaced persons across a country with almost no functioning civilian infrastructure left. Captured German military trucks filled that gap too. Displaced persons camps housing hundreds of thousands of refugees, liberated concentration camp survivors, and former forced laborers depended on ex-Wehrmacht transport just to receive basic supplies. Picture that for a moment. A truck that once hauled ammunition toward the Eastern Front now delivered flour and blankets to the very people that army had tried to destroy. Nobody planned that outcome. It simply happened because the vehicles existed and the need was desperate, and nobody had the luxury of asking where a truck came from before loading it with food for starving families. Scandinavia adds a chapter almost nobody in America has ever heard. Roughly 400,000 German troops occupied Norway by the end of the war, and every one of them needed transport across a country with brutal terrain and almost no rail network reaching the far north. When the occupation collapsed, the newly reformed Norwegian army inherited an enormous stockpile of German trucks left sitting in fjord-side depots from Oslo all the way up past the Arctic Circle. Norway had almost no domestic truck production of its own at the time, so rather than scrap this windfall, the government simply kept using it. Ex-Wehrmacht trucks stayed in active Norwegian military service for years, afterward patrolling roads through terrain so remote that replacing them quickly proved impossible. Some accounts describe these vehicles still turning up on active Norwegian bases well into the following decade, long after most of Western Europe had moved on to newer equipment entirely. Yugoslavia tells an even more dramatic version of the same pattern. Josip Broz Tito's partisan forces had already been capturing German military equipment throughout the war through ambush after ambush in the mountains. When the German collapse finally came, those partisans inherited entire abandoned motor pools across the Balkans virtually overnight. That captured transport became the backbone of the new Yugoslav National Army almost immediately, since the country had no functioning arms industry of its own left standing after 4 years of brutal occupation and civil war. A resistance movement that spent years blowing up German supply convoys ended the war by simply inheriting what was left of them. Trucks originally stamped with Wehrmacht unit markings rolled on through Yugoslav service for years under a red star instead of a swastika. Even the official paperwork trail hides a strange story of its own. The United States ran its European surplus disposal through an office called the Foreign Liquidation Commissioner, which handled the staggering job of selling off equipment nobody wanted to ship home across the Atlantic. Shipping a single truck back to America cost more than the vehicle itself was worth on paper, so most of it simply got sold in place. Entire fleets went to Allied governments at steep discounts. Private buyers and scrap dealers picked up whatever remained through public auctions held right there in occupied Germany. Some of that captured German equipment even got folded directly into these American surplus sales, since it sat in the same depots and needed the same disposal process as everything else. The paperwork survives today in American and British archives. Page after page of vehicle serial numbers and sale prices reads like a strange accounting ledger for the death of an entire war machine. Not every truck found a noble second life, though. Thousands simply vanished into black markets that exploded across occupied Germany during the chaotic years before the 1948 currency reform. Fuel was scarce and valuable enough to fund entire criminal networks. Vehicles got stripped for parts sold piece by piece to whoever could pay in cigarettes or coffee, since the official currency had become nearly worthless. Engine blocks turned into makeshift generators. Axles got repurposed for farm equipment. Entire truck bodies became temporary housing for families with nowhere else to live in a country where an estimated 20% of housing stock simply no longer existed. Occupation authorities tried repeatedly to track and register surviving military vehicles and repeatedly failed because the paperwork trail from a collapsed government meant nobody could prove who owned what. A truck with no papers and a working engine was worth more on the black market in 1946 than almost anything else you could find in the ruins of Germany. And then there's the part of this story that almost nobody expects. Some of these trucks are still out there today. Collectors across Europe and the United States have spent decades tracking down surviving Opel Blitz and Mercedes L4500 trucks pulled from barns and farms where they quietly worked as civilian haulers for 30 or 40 years after the war ended. Their military origins stayed forgotten by everyone except the rust stains where the old unit markings used to sit. Museums in Germany, France, and the United Kingdom now display fully restored examples. Some still run. Military vehicle rallies across Europe feature these same trucks rolling down roads they once traveled under entirely different circumstances 8 decades ago. A handful even appeared decades later in film productions needing authentic period transport because building an accurate replica costs more than simply restoring the real thing. One restorer in Germany spent nearly a decade tracking down a Mercedes L 4500 diesel he first spotted rusting in a hedgerow on a farm near the Dutch border. It still wore a barely visible unit number under decades of grime once the paint finally got stripped away. Another surviving Opel Blitz turned up not in a museum, but on a working farm in rural France, where 3 generations of the same family had used it to haul feed and firewood for over 50 years without ever fully realizing what they owned. Film productions chasing authentic period footage have gone looking for these same surviving trucks, rather than build replicas because getting the sound of that original engine right on camera turns out to matter more than most viewers would ever guess. Archivists digging through occupation-era photographs keep finding new evidence of just how far this scattering really went. Snapshots showed German military trucks photographed working construction sites in places as far-flung as French Algeria and British-administered Palestine only a few years after the surrender. These machines crossed entire continents simply because somebody somewhere still needed a working engine and didn't much care what flag it used to serve. So the wartime truck that once carried ammunition towards Stalingrad might be the same one now sitting under a tarp in a Bavarian farmer's barn or rolling proudly down a parade route at a vintage vehicle show. That's the part nobody expects when they picture what happened to Germany's military equipment after 1945. There was no single ending, no mass scrapyard swallowing every vehicle whole. Instead, 4 separate occupying powers each wrote their own chapter, and the trucks themselves scattered into 1,000 different fates. Some became reparations. Some became weapons of a colonial war nobody saw coming. Some became the literal machines that rebuilt German cities from rubble, and some simply disappeared into barns and black markets, never to be tracked again. Think about the sheer distance one of these machines could travel across its second life. A single Blitz truck rolling off the Rüsselsheim line in 1942 might have hauled supplies across the Russian steppe that same winter. It might have sat abandoned in a field near Kassel by May of 1945. It might have been requisitioned by French occupation forces that summer and spent years hauling rubble through a bombed-out German city under Allied supervision before turning up decades later at a vintage rally with none of the crowd realizing just how many different wars and countries and purposes that one engine block had already survived. No single vehicle carried every one of those chapters. But pieced together across thousands of surviving trucks, this is genuinely what happened to Germany's military transport fleet. It didn't vanish in one dramatic ending. It dissolved into 1,000 smaller ones, each traceable, if you know exactly where to look. What this story really reveals is something bigger than trucks. It shows how quickly the machinery of total war gets repurposed, the moment that war actually ends. Nobody sits down and plans an orderly transition from destruction to reconstruction. It happens in fragments. A relief worker grabs whatever vehicle still runs. A farmer buys an engine block for almost nothing because nobody's asking questions anymore. A colonial army short on transport simply repaints what it finds and calls it theirs. History rarely resolves as cleanly as the textbooks suggest. The real story sits in these overlooked details, the trucks that outlived the army that built them, the machines that ended up serving 4 different flags within a single decade, the rubble-clearing convoys rolling through the same streets they helped destroy only months before. Somewhere in a museum garage in Koblenz or a private collection outside Paris, sits a truck built in 1943 to serve an army that no longer exists, carrying a history most of its current owners will never fully know. It survived the war. It survived reparations and black markets and colonial jungles half a world away. And it's still here almost 80 years later as proof that even in the wreckage of the worst war in human history, nothing simply disappears. It just changes hands and keeps moving forward. If this kind of hidden history fascinates you as much as it fascinates me, then make sure you're subscribed, because the next untold story from World War II's aftermath is coming soon, and it might be even stranger than this one.